Hello and welcome to Libero, the podcast about the most important of the least important things, as Rob Earnshaw once said. My name's Jack Pitt-Brooke, I'm from The Athletic. I'm joined today by Jonathan Wilson and Tariq Panja from the New York Times. Tariq, you've just been in Milan.
I've been watching some football in Milan from Libya, which is quite weird. The Libyan Premier League is finishing its season in Milan in three stadiums. The country's split in two, so three teams from the east, three teams from the west, and I attended the Tripoli derby between Al Ahly and Ittihad on Sunday. Well, it was more of a fight than a football match. Quite some scenes there.
Amazing. Well, we're going to talk today about the Championship, which starts on Friday. It's a really exciting season and a really exciting league. I think the question that everyone is asking, I think everyone's looking forward to seeing how Birmingham City, the stars of built-in Birmingham, will get on against Ipswich Town on Friday, and then about how Wrexham, the stars of Welcome to Wrexham, will get on against Southampton on Saturday. Jonathan, let's start with you. Are you more excited about the football or about the documentaries?
I mean, you shouldn't judge the world by what I think. I'm more excited by the football, but I think others are more excited by the documentary. For all my misgivings about the documentaries, it has injected money into both Wrexham and Birmingham. They have done incredibly well with that money. I mean, Birmingham last season, I saw the game in the FA Cup when they lost very narrowly to Newcastle. They were really good that day. They could easily have won that game and it wouldn't have been a freak. 111 points. They were, I mean, arguably too big a team for that division anyway, but they were really, really good last season. It'd be interesting to see how high that will take them in the Championship, because I think there has been a sense over the last 4 or 5 years it has been a bit of a gulf growing between the two divisions, and yet you've seen Sunderland and Ipswich sort of go almost straight. I mean, Ipswich go straight through. Sunderland have one season in the Championship, so it'd be interesting to see if Birmingham can follow that. Wrexham, I suspect, will find it slightly tougher, but they've been playing really good football as well. They've already invested significantly this summer with
Connor Cody, Kiefer Moore, Danny Ward, Josh Windass.
Yes, all of them coming in. I think it was 8 players coming in, isn't it, in total? I think those are the big names. So I would assume they'll be sort of knocking on the door of the playoffs at the very least. That doesn't sort of overcome my disquiet about the documentaries and this idea that a football club is now something more than just, I guess it's always been more than just about winning football matches, but the idea that it is this sort of content production machine, that seems to me it could create some slightly odd incentives further down the line.
Tarek, where do you stand on the world of kind of in-house documentaries?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like Wilson there. I'm a bit torn on it. The football team being used as a vehicle for something completely different, really. It's the football and the team going up and down the league seems to be a byproduct of whatever it is they're trying to sell. But in the case of Wrexham, it is huge. This television show in the United States is massive, and I wonder if, I don't know, if they bought another team that wasn't called Wrexham in Wales. I mean, the fact they picked this particular place is also quite interesting in a way. I guess on balance, you've got to say it has been positive. There's good vibes around the town. The fans are happy. The team is coming up the league, and people are travelling to Wrexham. There has been this pilgrimage to the town from various places in the US and beyond. So also, I wonder, you can't have too many of these as well. Surely, Wrexham have got this first mover advantage with Ryan Reynolds and his mates. Then you have Tom Brady here with Birmingham. That's probably it, right? I mean, what do you guys think? How many more of these football team come TV programs can you actually have that are going to elicit this much interest?
Well, surely the outcome is that every streaming platform will have their own one, right? Like Wrexham is very much a Disney product, but presumably every platform, and there are a lot of them, will think, well, Wrexham has done so well for Disney. Why don't we just find some celebrities to buy a League One team or League Two team, and we can do it ourselves? Like people don't make original. I wouldn't. I think people are kind of happy to think unoriginally about this sort of thing.
I mean, the danger is though that each one sort of needs a gimmick, and the gimmick becomes increasingly absurd. And yeah, you look at. I've been doing a lot of research recently on the NASL, which began '67, the second attempt to introduce professional soccer into the US. And the gimmicks that they came up with there are just so ludicrous. A team with sort of leather fringes on their shirts. One of them signed Gordon Banks as the one-eyed goalie. It's just sort of things that seem excruciating. But you can imagine, just to try and set your documentary apart, you try and find something unique, something new, and you overblow something in the local area with a degree of absurdity. But I'm also interested by what fans think, because as far as I can tell, and maybe this is just because they've done well, Wrexham fans, Birmingham fans are totally on board with this. They're very happy with this. But I mean, Jack, you're connected with Dulwich Hamlet, who very much rejected Peter Crouch and his attempts to turn Dulwich Hamlet into a documentary.
Yeah, so Peter Crouch, who did play for Dulwich briefly a long time ago at the start of his career, he made a show about Dulwich about 5 or 6 years ago, and I didn't watch it. I didn't watch 1 minute of it. I just wasn't interested. I thought it was. I wasn't furious about it. I think that it's tough being a non-league team, and particularly a non-league team who plays by the rules financially. And so if you get the chance to make a bit of money, I can see the upside of doing it. But I just had no interest in it. Like I felt like I already knew quite a lot about the running of the club through my own support, my own reporting, and it just I just wasn't curious to see how it looked on TV.
But my sense from the outside, maybe I've sort of misconstrued this from a couple of conversations, and I've sort of extrapolated that to think it was a broader movement. It actually was actually resistance, but because of, part of the sort of the ethos of Dulwich Hamlet is it's sort of pure football, it's authentic football. The idea of being this producer of content was that itself was rejected on a very fundamental level.
Yeah, certainly, and lots of my mates who are big fans were more opposed to it than I was. I mean, I remember like by the on a wall by the toilets down one side of the ground, someone has painted onto the wall, "Dulwich Hamlet will not be televised," and so I thought it was a bit of a shame that in the end they ended up having their celebrity fronted behind the scenes documentary. But I fear that's maybe just the way of the world now. But it is weird, like it did make me think about Wrexham in the sense that because I'm into non-league football, I initially, when the Wrexham thing happened, I wasn't that opposed to it as some people, on the basis that there are so many terrible owners in the National League who are either not interested, or who are interested in the wrong things, or who are trying to turn the ground into flats or whatever, that to have owners who are enthusiastic, seemingly interested in the success of the club, and willing to help the club succeed and to get more people to come and watch. I initially couldn't think that was a bad thing, but now, I mean, every time they get promoted, I think my enthusiasm, or my kind of acceptance of it is sort of arose a little bit more. And now they're all the way up in the, because the thing is, it is, I mean, I don't know if financial doping is the right term, but it does give them a huge advantage. Like when Wrexham were in League Two in 23-24, so Swiss Ramble did some analysis on this recently, which is a Substack that's really worth looking into if you're into this sort of thing. He wrote that when Wrexham were in League Two in 23-24, not only did they have the highest revenue by far in League Two, but they generated more than every club in League One and 11 clubs in the Championship. So even quite relatively early on into the project, and I remember when they got promoted to the National League, it didn't feel inevitable that they would do that. Like they did that by the skin of their teeth. They were already like so much bigger and richer, and you can see that because they signed, they'd be able to sign like, I don't know, James McLean or Stephen Fletcher, really like Premier League proven players into the lower levels. So clearly it does have a distorting effect on competitive balance.
And I've got two further concerns. The Wrexham fans are entirely within the right to say, who cares, we're enjoying this. bad things happen in football, good things happen in football. You accept it as it comes, and I'm fairly on board with that from their point of view. On a more general point, though, I've got two questions. So the first is, what happens when they hit their ceiling? I mean, this is a club, the capacity of the ground still, I think, 15,000. Now, maybe they can extend that to 20, 25. I don't know realistically how many fans they can get regularly, but let's say they can go up to 25, 30, and that would be the equivalent to smaller Premier League clubs. But that jump from Championship to Premier League is enormous. And even, to be honest, and I think we're going to talk about this with parachute payments, there's quite a step up to go from mid-table Championship to top 6, 7, 8 Championship. So they will at some point reach their ceiling. What do they do then? The documentary is not going to work of follow this mid-table Championship side as they remain mid-table. Gasp as they get to the fourth round of the Cup and go out. Swoon as they go out in the third round of the League Cup to Doncaster. That's not a viable product. So what do they then do? Do they try and sort of jazz it up by making absurd signings? We're bringing Mario Balotelli out of retirement or whatever. And then so that would be a concern. The decisions are made for the documentary, not for the football team. And they're not there yet, and maybe I'm sort of catastrophizing. My other question is, what happens when this comes to an end? At some point, Ryan Reynolds is going to think, actually, I'm not sure my life project is Wrexham. Maybe I've got other films to make or other things to invest in. And you hope that he would leave it running and he'd continue to invest. There'd continue to be some money there and it could keep going. But there's a reason why Wrexham were where they were. And it's because that's sort of their natural level. That's what their fan base, the economy of a local area, that's where it places them. Is there a danger at some point he leaves and they end up like Gretna, for instance? I mean, Gretna's obviously an extreme case where they had a millionaire owner, Miles Kington, was that his name? And got them racing up through the Scottish leagues. He died. His heirs couldn't care less about Gretna, and the thing collapses into bankruptcy. And I think it doesn't exist anymore, or certainly doesn't exist in the same way. So, they're my two concerns.
Both of those. The first one is one where you think, what's going to be the plot twist, right? If this is a soap opera of a show, and that those are the things that draw in the audiences. What are you going to do for your plot twist? And the idea that you use a football club as a mechanism for all that isn't great. And you've seen other examples of this that are documentaries as well. Remember those dudes that were trying to buy Bradford, the crypto dudes trying to buy Bradford, and that was fan outrage eventually when they realised. Who initially they thought these were benign. Oh, we're getting our own American investors. We're coming back, and it quickly turned out these were just some guys trying to hawk some coins using Bradford. I think they ended up at Crawley. I don't think that's gone very well there. So yeah, the risk, and also who's looking at any of this? The only thing about who's not allowed to own a football club in the United Kingdom seems to be, are you a criminal? And even then, there's been cases where, well, you didn't commit the crime here in the UK, in you come. So I guess someone needs to be looking after this stuff. No, nobody really is. The second point is, look, from a fan's point of view, and this would be interesting if people would write in or contact us. It'd be interesting to know about this. Is that okay? Do you want to be on the journey at any cost as well? Like, you've been in whichever division you've been in for, or between one or two divisions for 20, 30 years, but this is something different and you're on a journey. If the risk is something that is snakes and ladders and you're going to come all the way down, is that something you're willing to tolerate? That's something that I'd be interested to know from supporters of teams like this.
I mean, to be fair to the EFL and the Premier League as well, I've talked to people at both about this, about the fit and proper persons test, or whatever it's not called that anymore.
Owners and directors test.
Owners and directors test. And essentially, they're really restricted in what they can do because they're terrified of being sued. So if you've committed a criminal offence in this country, it's black and white. They can stop you. And just somebody at the Premier League said that you see, we have files and files and files of people we have stopped, but obviously you don't hear about that, and we can't release the files. We'd love to, but we have confidentiality, and we can't do it. So I do sympathise with them that there's not a legal mechanism for people to be stopped buying a business, and that unfortunately is what a football club still is. Now, whether the regulator, which has been voted on this week, whether that will change that. I mean, personally, I'm sceptical, but maybe it'll help.
Really interesting. I think it's really interesting to come into this topic of ownership. I think before we come to the topic of competitiveness in the Championship, because it strikes me in the Championship that the kind of, for want of a better phrase, Wild West quality that there used to be in the Premier League, like let's say 10, 15 years ago, in terms of owners, not always foreign, often sometimes UK owners as well, but who were seen to be running down clubs, doing things the wrong way. My impression is that the Premier League is now so competitive, the level is so high, and that there is so much money that generally, like, bad examples of bad ownership in the Premier League often tend to kind of just correct down into the Championship. But it does mean you get some really awful situations within the Championship. I think Sheffield Wednesday is the most obvious one, although not the only one. There's lots of other, fans ask, I don't know, a fan of Blackburn Rovers if they're happy with how their club's being run, for example, in the last sort of 10, 15 years. And the stuff that's coming out of Sheffield Wednesday is amazing. Like the lack of players pulling out the friendly last week. Obviously, they've lost Danny Roll. They've lost tons of players over the summer. They have repeatedly failed to pay wages to players and staff over recent months. They haven't had a training ground over the course of this summer. There's kind of long overdue work on the stadium going on, and so on and so forth. It's clearly a real mess at Sheffield Wednesday. Do you guys feel that the kind of conditions in the Championship, namely the sort of lack of regulation, but also the huge incentives to get into the Premier League, mean that the Championship is maybe a bit more exposed to the wrong sort of owners than the Premier League?
Yeah, it's that pull, isn't it? Because the Premier League is that next rung, and there's a type of businessman who's seeing all those shiny coins available in the Premier League. If I could just do this on the cheap, I've got access to the honeypot. Then we're seeing that for sure. Across the Championship and lower down, I think, as well. If you go through the EFL, people are coming in from all sorts of places with the carrot of the Premier League, whether it's League One as well, and then that's a hop, skip, and a jump into paradise, right? So, yeah, and the numbers. I was looking at Luton, for example, and I think despite the relegation, I'm sure their fans might speak differently, but we were thinking these people are sane and sensible given what they did when they went to the Premier League. They didn't spend heavily, and now look what's happened. But their numbers are worth looking at because it gives you a great insight into that gap. So the year before Luton were in the Premier League, they got £10 million from the EFL for the season in the Championship. The next year from the Premier League, they got 132 million quid. Now, it's really hard to run any business, whether it's a football club or anything, with that gap. And what did they do? Contrary to what it looks like, they did spend significant amounts of money. They spent about 80 million when they were in the Premier League. But knowing they're going to probably get relegated, they banked for this new stadium and then the parachute payments, which will give Luton, I guess, this cushion to come up and build the stadium. Is that the right way of doing things, though?
I mean, I can't blame them for doing that because that is the model that we've got. And my feelings on parachute payments are pretty conflicted. I understand why a great swathe of Championship clubs are very opposed to them because it does give a massive advantage to teams who've been in the Premier League. That you can get lucky in a playoff final. You finish sixth in the league. You finish 25 points behind automatic promotion. Maybe 24 points behind the team that's finished third. You hit form in the playoffs. get a couple of happy bounces to the ball. Suddenly you're in the Premier League. You're getting vast sums for being in the Premier League. You're getting greater exposure on a global level. So you'll sort of, I mean, maybe not many, but you'll get some fans from around the world just by being there. Then if you get relegated straight away, you get the parachute payments. And you should be able to guarantee at least being top 6 off the back of that. So you're getting sort of 3-4 years money. In championship terms, you're getting sort of 30-40 years money in one go. So obviously those teams have a massive advantage. But if you don't have parachute payments, or if you don't have some way of bridging that gulf between the Championship and the Premier League, and we've seen anyway that the last 6 promoted teams over the last 2 seasons have all come straight back down. Even with those advantages, it's really hard to stay in the Premier League. If you say to the clubs, well, actually, it's one season and that's it. What players are they going to get in who are going to be prepared to do a 1-year job or potentially a 1-year job where you'd have to put in a relegation clause and say, yeah, if we get relegated, your wages go down to whatever. They're not going to be able to speculate. They're not going to be able to. I mean, Sunderland this summer have spent 140 million euros. Okay, they've got 40 million euros in, but 100 million euros net. There's no way they could do that without knowing they've got a couple of years cushion to sort themselves out afterwards. But if they didn't do that, then they just, they might as well not play next season. Just say, okay, we'll give our points away, give us 150 million quid, and we won't play for a season. So it's I don't know what you can do to ameliorate that huge leap from Championship to Premier League.
Yeah, I think Wilson's hit the nail on the head. It's impossible to think about the Championship outside of the context of parachute payments. If you look at, say, the 23-24 figures, that let's say most Championship teams, their revenue will be between, let's say, 20 and 40 million a year, and they'll also be spending around 20 to 40 million a year on wages. But parachute payments in your first season are almost 50 million. So it's creating a completely... The parachute payment teams and non-parachute payment teams live in a completely different financial world. If you go back and look through the last 6 seasons, the 2 teams who got promoted automatically from the Championship into the Premier League, I'm leaving the playoffs to one side because, as Jonathan said at the top of the show, there's an element of randomness in who gets promoted from the playoffs. 10 of the 12 teams to get automatically promoted from the Championship into the Premier League were in their first or second season down from the Premier League, as in they were in receipt of big parachute payment money. So in 2025 you got Leeds and Burnley, in 2024 you got Leicester and then Ipswich, who were not in receipt of parachute payment money. In 2023 you got Burnley and Sheffield United. 2022 you got Fulham and Bournemouth. 2021 Norwich and Watford. 2020 Leeds and West Brom. So the only 2 examples out of 12 there, teams who were not in receipt of parachute money, were Ipswich Town, who had a lot of momentum, a brilliant young manager, and also access to Jamestown data, courtesy of Brighton Hove Albion. And you got Leeds United, who had a Marcelo Bielsa. So basically, it's unless you have one of the all-time great managers, or a very good coming together of various different factors like Ipswich Town did, which is maybe a bit of a one-off. It's very, very difficult. And so I think looking at this season's Championship, it's not. I mean, the best squad by far is Ipswich Town. A contact of mine said to me the other day that Ipswich is kind of the Championship all-stars. You don't even have to sell all your best players when you get relegated anymore if you don't want to. They've kept Doug Benny, they've kept Schmodex, they've kept Jack Clark. They've got George Hurst, Philogene. They've got lots of the good defenders they had the previous season. I mean, it remains to be seen about obviously Southampton have brought in Will Still as manager. Leicester City have got, I think, Cifuentes from QPR as the new manager. But the level is, it would be a surprise if Ipswich weren't there. And I think what the parachute payments do is they show that all the stuff that the Championship likes to say about itself, which is, it's the most competitive league in the world, it's the league where anyone can beat anyone, which is basically the things that even the Premier League can't say with a straight face anymore. Even that isn't even true in the Championship, I don't think, anymore. But I mean, the Championship is almost as financially stratified and therefore predictable as the Premier League.
And you saw that last season, that Leeds and Burnley go up with 100 points. And 100 points used to win you that league by a million miles. I mean, very few teams got to 100 points. Was Sunderland the first team to get 100 points
Didn't
in
City-
98-9?
Sorry, didn't Kevin Keegan's Manchester? Was it Kevin Keegan's Manchester City? I'm going to get this wrong. I'd hate to get this wrong. Bernabeu and Berkovic era. I'm going to have to look this up right now. I think in my biased mind, that's the best Championship team of all time. But I might be wrong.
Well, the Sunderland team that went up with Perming 2 from a front four of Kevin Phillips, Niall Quinn, Danny Dichio and Michael Bridges, which is a ludicrous front four to pick 2 from. They got 105 points, which was the record. Reading subsequently took the record. But I mean, what we're talking about is these were very rare occurrences. For 2 teams to get 100 points is unique. And yet, it's not that either of those sides go up thinking, well, we're going to be mid-table, we might even be able to push on and get into Europe. Both of those sides and Sunderland are thinking, we would absolutely bite your hand off for 17th. Tell us about Kevin Keegan, Jack.
Oh, so what I was going to say is, of course, the really weird thing about last season is that Sheffield United were also on course for 100 points. And it was only to Sunderland's advantage, obviously, in the last few weeks of the season that Sheffield United went off the boil. But we could easily, I mean, it felt like, let's say a month or two before the end of the year, we were looking at 3 teams getting 100 points. So actually, I was wrong. The great 2001-2 Manchester City team got 99 points. Back then they had Bernabeu and Berkovic playing as twin number 10s in the Championship. So don't let anyone tell you that Pep Guardiola invented attacking football at Manchester City.
It's intriguing that you thought that side got 100 points. A lot of people think that his entertainers, his Newcastle side, got a huge number of points, got a huge number of goals. It's just not true. They were slightly above average, just easy on the eye, but not much substance. That's what I'd say.
So you're saying like you've got to really screw it up, though. So Leicester, bit of a meltdown in the Premier League last season. For them not to come up is an indictment on the mess of the club. Then, given the stats.
Yeah, I'd say that is. Yeah, I would say that is true. But they are in a mess. They've really been all over the place. I know they got promoted 2 seasons ago, but they've been all over the place for sort of 3-4 years now. I think, although they've got the parachute payments, they don't have access to all of it, do they? They've got debts to pay. Yeah, they've been very fortunate to escape point deductions for PSR breaches. They've managed to keep ducking out of whoever's got what's the word I'm looking for, jurisdiction over them. That they're in the Premier League by the time the EFL catch up with them, and then they're in the EFL by the time the Premier League catch up with them. Like they're dotting back and forth of the US-Mexico border in the late 19th century. Yeah, like cattle rustlers in a film. But I'm not sure how long that can go on. And the fact that they have had to sell Danny Ward, Conor Cody this summer. I mean, have they signed anybody apart from Begovic, who's probably be reserve keeper? I'm not sure they have. Their squad does not look as healthy as Southampton or Ipswich's.
But Leicester's a really instructive example, as Jonathan says. Obviously they got kind of really surprisingly relegated in 2023 from the Premier League. That's when they had to sell Maddison and so on. I think Harvey Barnes as well. But even then, like the team that went into the Championship had, I think it was the second at the time. It was the second highest ever Championship wage bill, behind Rafa's Newcastle in 16-17. Like they still had, by Championship standards, a monstrously good squad. They had Ricardo Pereira, Kelechi, Ndidi, Vardy, Vestergaard, Cody. They kept Albrighton, Wout Fass, and so on. Like these are all Premier League proven players, and they went straight back up, and Enzo Maresca gets the Chelsea job, and so on. And again, that would not be possible without the huge parachute payment cushion. I believe they still lost money, which is why they're in this cycle that Jonathan identified. But it goes to prove the point that Jonathan was making earlier, which is that there's a kind of distinct class of teams now who are too rich for the Championship, but in most cases not good enough for the Premier League. And we've seen that with what's now 2 seasons in a row in which all 3 promoted teams have gone back down, but also gone back down with incredibly low aggregate points totals. So the aggregate points total in when it was Luton, Burnley and Sheffield United the season before last, the three teams got 66 points between them, which is pretty poor. Last season, Leicester, Ipswich and Southampton got 59 points between them. So they just didn't, none of those, they were all historically bad teams, really, and none of them made the slightest impression on the Premier League whatsoever. And this, I think, creates a weird dynamic in the Premier League, whereby you've essentially got a league of 17, and there's obviously there's strata within that 17, but it really kills the sense of jeopardy. Like Tottenham, Man United, Wolves, Everton and West Ham, all really, really bad in the league last year. It felt like they knew by January or February, it doesn't matter how bad we are, we can't go down. We're not going to go down because the other three are so bad. And it really kind of, and obviously there's a specific circumstance here, which is that Tottenham and Man United were both competing in the Europa League at the same time. But it meant that all the league games involving those teams had this weird, they had kind of all the tension sucked out of them in the back end of the season because they knew they were under no threat of relegation.
Well, Jack, we were both at the game where Spurs won 4-1 at Ipswich, which I think was a game that mathematically meant Tottenham was safe, which was, I guess, in the March, was it? And I remember Postecoglou in the February, and Postecoglou sort of laughing off the idea that Spurs could ever be relegated. So you lost 22 games, was it, in the end they lost last season? Like, you should be on the brink of relegation if you're losing 22 games. And it was sort of this, I mean, he wasn't wrong. And the fact that they're mathematically safe in February, they obviously weren't close to relegation. But there's something absurd about that. You know, if you want to look at the rolling average of the relegated sides, of the promoted sides, so the three sides who go up, what they do the next season, I think I might have run through these stats before, so I'll do it quickly. If you look, say, the rolling 5-year average to 2000-2001, the three promoted sides going from the Championship to the Premier League, they averaged 41.66 points between them over those 5 seasons. You look at, I actually haven't updated the stats for last season, the season before it was 34.02. It's clearly going to fall even lower when I add next season in. So you're talking about over a 5-year period, so there's a flattening off process. That's dropping by 7 points over 20 years, which is huge. Or if you just look at the actual average of the promoted sides, for the season 22-3, it was 43 points. Then it was 22 points, and last season it was 59 points between them, wasn't it? So it's 19.67 points. It feels like there's almost a 50% come off over the last 2 or 3 years, and that's really unhealthy, I think. And that's why I really hope Sunderland stay up, but I really hope that at least one, if not two, of the promoted sides can stay up this season, just because otherwise it feels a bit futile. It feels like we've got a 17-team Super League, and what's the point in even having promotion and relegation?
Also, just being in the league there. So the day your team got promoted, it must be, really, really exciting, particularly if you haven't been in the Premier League before or haven't been there a long time. But then the reality of being in the Premier League, if this trend as we've described here continues, it can't be that exciting either, can it? Like, you're just going in there to be fodder, to get smashed week in, week out, and then coming down, and then probably being in the promotion pushing. This idea of, Jack mentioned the word jeopardy, and that's it. That doesn't feel like sport at some point, where this preordained destiny of these clubs is right there. You get there, you get hammered, you bank the money, you come back, you're richer than your rivals, and you do it again. That can't be the football pyramid that everyone has been talking about trying to save, right?
But I also feel like I'm kind of speaking on behalf of other fan bases here, but I don't think that I'm not sure that being a very rich team in the Championship and kind of grinding your way towards 100 points, knowing that if you don't do it, it would be a colossal failure. I don't feel like that's much fun either. I just know this anecdotally through talking to mates of mine who are big Leeds fans. Obviously, they lost the playoff final to Southampton in their first season back down, and then last season it kind of looked a bit wobbly at times, but eventually they got there. And obviously there was a huge amazing scene of celebration when they got promoted at the end of the season, and Daniel Farke was on the pitch and so on. But during the course of the season, all the Leeds fans I spoke to seemed to be incredibly stressed about the fact that they were worried, we're 1 point behind Burnley, we're 2 points behind Sheffield United. and so on. So I often feel like the sort of stratification isn't fun for anyone, basically, in modern football, and even if you're in the top, I'm sure people will say, "Oh yeah, cry me a river," but even if you're in the top strata in your league, the expectations that come with it make it not fun.
No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean,
because you're
last
just
season
supposed to be just in that block, I guess.
Exactly, and I think most. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Jonathan, what's the Sun? I guess there's two kind of Sunderland related points here. One is, I mean, it kind of seems stupid to say how much fun was last season with this kind of what was really from the outside, one of the most surprising promotions in recent years. I think Sunderland, like even, I mean, I guess with Luton as well. Luton coming up via the playoffs in 2023, because even Forest in 2022. They obviously had investment, and Brentford in 2021 had been close, and they obviously had brilliant owners and a structure. Sunderland was from the outside at least was a big surprise. How did it feel to you? And also to Tariq's previous point, like if Sunderland get 25 points in the Premier League next season, and we have to expect that will probably happen, sadly, will that be fun, or will it be like, oh, isn't it nice to go back to Anfield?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how much of a surprise was it, I think Forest, you got to remember how bad they were the first half of the season that went up. I mean, it was only the January when they made that sort of fleet of signings that suddenly propelled them into the playoffs, which is why then the next season they had to sign 3.5 million players in August or whatever it was. Which turned out, although they ended up with a points deduction, it turned out that was the right thing to do. That kept them up, and now last season it looked like they could qualify for Champions League for a long time. I think you always wonder with that ownership how volatile it could be. I don't think you necessarily say Forest are absolutely categorically 100% safe, but equally they could well qualify for Europe again this season. So Forest was hugely surprising. Sunderland did start the season really well. They had been in the playoffs the year, not the previous season, but the year before that. They had a very bad end to the previous season, when it just sort of felt like everything was drifting. So certainly from the summer, because nobody really knew anything about Régis Lebris, but it turned out he's actually really good. It turned out that the identification of young talent has been very, very good. But then from sort of February on, you talk about the stratification, but last season was a really weird season in the Championship, where certainly at the top, that stratification was there are 3 teams better than all the rest. There is then Sunderland, who are nowhere near as good as those 3, but way, way better than everybody else. So I think basically from February onwards, Sunderland had a 10-point gap either side of them all the way through. I mean, they didn't win a game. Was it the last 7 games of the season? They didn't win because they just started resting players, which is a huge gamble. And with my fans hat on, I was sort of, what are you doing? You've got to go in the playoffs with momentum. Everybody knows momentum is key in the playoffs. But it turns out resting players and then scoring a goal in injury time in each of the 3 games in the playoffs. Turns out that Régis Lebris knew exactly what he was doing, and I didn't. And so, I mean, I remember that night after the playoff final, which was amazing, because even that game, Sunderland equalised, what was it, 71, 72 minutes, scored the last minute, or scored the injury time winner. That was like that's the greatest day Sunderland have had since the Cup final in 73. As a one-off afternoon. I'm not saying it's the best team. I'm not saying that the football wasn't better in 98-9 as a whole, but as a day, just as a brilliant afternoon to celebrate. That was incredible. It was a privilege to be there. And yet, even as he left the ground, everybody was like, well, we better enjoy it now because it's going to be horrible next season. To be honest, I'd written off this season. I'd already written it off. And then the signing started. It's like, oh, hang on. Christian Spakeman's proved pretty good at identifying talent before. Sunderland have actually gone out and spent a load of money. They spent it really early in the window, so they obviously had these targets sort of lined up. They're not just scrabbling around going, oh, look, there's Marcus Stewart. We'll have a Marcus Stewart. These are very sort of targeted signings. The fact that players like Granit Xhaka suddenly decide, I've just finished second in the Bundesliga, but the thing I really want, I mean, maybe this says something about Erik ten Hag and his training, that 2 training sessions with ten Hag is like, oh my God, my life's ambition is to live in Sunderland. But Granit Xhaka seems exactly what Sunderland needs. So I still think they've got a terrible, terrible fight on their hands. But I now have a glimmer of optimism I didn't previously have. But if they do go up, and if they do, if they do stay up, Jack mentioned that you either have to have the data and the great coach of a very good coach that Ipswich had, the great coach that Leeds had. That's what you need to stay up. Or you need the sort of investment Forest had, of the data that Brentford had, coupled with an extremely good coach. I think Sunderland might have an extremely good coach. I'm not 100% certain yet, but the signs are promising. It looks like the talent identification is pretty good. And of course, they have a huge advantage. They do have guaranteed 48,000 fans every week, which, okay, it's not from a wealthy area. That's not going to bring in the same sponsorship or advertising or merchandising you would get if you had 48,000 fans in London or Manchester. But it's still better than having 25,000 fans. And I think there is a possibility they stay up and yeah, but that is the aim. Yeah, I don't think there's a single Sunderland fan who wouldn't bite your hand off for 17th. It's just that's as good as it's going to get.
The other point that I think is really worth remembering in the context of the Championship, particularly with regard to the richer teams, is that in the context of European football, they're really rich. You know, their ability, I think this has been proven so many times in the Championship in the last particularly the last 5 or 10 years. The ability of Championship teams to go and sign really, really good players and good managers from around Europe is huge. And there's two incredibly obvious reasons for this. One is that if you're a big Championship team in receipt of parachute payments, your annual revenue is going to be what, £100 million a year? And remember, the bottom teams in the Premier League are generally bringing in what, 120, 130 million a year, and that means that you can go and you can enter the marketplace and sign very, very good players from abroad. The other point, which again is super obvious, is that if you're a young player or a young coach anywhere in Europe and your goal is I have to get to the Premier League, the Championship's a really good way to do that. You come into the Championship, you can hope, maybe your team will get promoted, or maybe you'll just do really well and then you'll get signed by someone. So if you look at the market this year, Ipswich Town obviously got relegated last season, parachute payments, they've got tons of money relative to the other teams in the Championship. They've just signed Azor Matusiwa from Rennes, who, by all accounts has been one of the, really, really impressive player in France the last few years. He played for Reims before he was at Rennes. And, but that's just a very, very typical signing, isn't it, Jonathan? Because, Championship teams they're not even having to go and buy from, I don't know, the Slovenian league or the Bulgarian league. They can go into the top 5 leagues and buy.
Yeah, I think the Championship is the 5th biggest league by revenue in the world, which is bizarre. I mean, I think by attendance it's in the top 12. So to an extent, it's fair enough. It should have revenue, but if it's, I think it's, I mean, obviously these figures can change season by season, but it's definitely between the 11th and 15th best attended league in the world. But the fact it's able to compete as having the 5th highest revenue, of course you can go to France or Germany. I mean, the fact that, Sunderland, Wilson Isidore, signed him from Russia. Certain complications there with sanctions, had to sign him through a Croatian bank, I think. But he turned down a load of French teams. He is French. Turned down a load of French teams to come to Sunderland because A, I guess the money was good, and B, he thought, you know what, if this goes well, I could be in the Premier League. Then my wages are stratospheric, my profile is stratospheric. So, but I think there's two things going on. So there's the money, but there's also, it's an attractive league to play in because the stadiums are good, the crowds are good, it's a nice environment. You're not playing in front of a handful of people in decrepit stadiums. The Championship is a good experience, and maybe that's something that we haven't sort of acknowledged enough. For all our concerns over the finances, for all the sort of Wild West nature of some of it, big crowds, good football, still competitive. I mean, sure, the stratification. The fact that you have the playoffs means that sort of slightly random teams can finish 5th or 6th and get into the playoffs and then could get promoted. There is that sort of sniff of glory there in a way that perhaps isn't there in the Premier League. And it does sort of feel to me, I mean, maybe it's slightly moving away from this towards a greater stratification, but certainly 4 or 5 years ago, it felt like what football should be. There should be some big teams at the top. You don't want everybody to be exactly the same. You want there to be a sense of excitement when the giant comes to town, or if you beat the team who's in the top 2 or 3, that should mean something. But the fact that you couldn't go into any season and say, well, they have no chance of promotion. You could say they have a small chance of promotion, but we've seen teams come from nowhere to at least be on the fringes of promotion, and that's a very, very good thing. It's an attractive product.
I think also that playoff thing is really, really exciting. The fact is, those spots are, you can go very deep into the season down to mid-table, even further down, and have a late charge. So your interest in the competition is there just to get into that even that last championship playoff position. That for me is really exciting, and that whether you follow the league as a fan of a team or as a sort of a rubbernecking football enthusiast, the championship is an exciting league by dint of this as well. And you're looking at those transfer fees as well and the transfers they're making. They are, I would say, the championship teams this season will be competing with Ligue 1 teams that aren't Paris Saint-Germain, Marseille, for example, for football players. This is one of the world's top leagues, if you think about it. We're saying the French league is in one of the top five in Europe. We're saying the championship is in that group as well. You know what? That's very exciting for English football. If you're a person living in England, you've got two of Europe's top leagues here in England. That's also something to celebrate as well, I'd say.
So I don't know if you guys saw the interview with that Daniel Levy did with Gary Neville on the Overlap
I didn't.
this week,
Yeah.
which I thought was, I thought the most interesting thing about it was the fact that it existed. I mean, we don't really hear a lot from Daniel Levy. It's the most we've heard from him since the Amazon documentary, which obviously followed the 29-20 season. So it's been 5 years. He's not in the spotlight much, but he came back. I think Tottenham are trying to be a bit more front foot with and proactive with media stuff at the moment, and so I think that's why we saw Levy. And the interesting thing about the interview is that it's not really that much about Tottenham until the last sort of 5 or 10 minutes, but the main body of it is Levy and Neville talking about the football pyramid and football governance, and really getting into the weeds on stuff like associated party transactions and multi-club ownership and a regulator and so on. And Neville's clearly pushing a view which is the Premier League has a responsibility to the whole pyramid, and they should go and do a deal with the EFL for to kind of reduce the cliff edges, as he describes them, in English football. I think that, and Levy's view is what you might characterise as a kind of Premier League in-house view. I think, like he says, we'd do a deal if the EFL came to us. We'd love to do a deal. He says that Tottenham would be happy to give away some of, to surrender some of their money for the good of the game and so on. And but I think the interesting thing to me was, I mean, how do you see these obvious cliff edges being smoothed? Because really the story, I mean, what we've been talking about so far, is really the story of stratification, right? We haven't even got into the topic of the strata within the 17 established Premier League teams, and I'm sure we'll do that next week before the new season. But the gaps between those kind of, I think on a previous episode we called them mezzanine clubs, some people call them yo-yo clubs, and then the rest of the championship is obviously huge. Tariq, can you explain a little bit about the politics of parachute payments and this kind of proposed Premier League EFL deal, what it might look like, and what you think might be the way to fix this?
It doesn't look like it's going to happen, to be honest. The so-called deal. It looks like the two sides just are not going to meet. From the EFL's point of view, or from Rick Parry, who's chairman of the EFL, doesn't want any parachute payments at all. The idea is the parachute payments distort the league, and the EFL has done a bunch of studies, and they say, look, it's at least 3-1 advantage to parachute teams to compared to others in terms of performance. That completely distorts the competition, and that is not what football should be about. The Premier League offered £900 million over 6 years, which sounds like a huge amount of money, and it is a huge amount of money. But then you've got to think the Premier League generates what, 6.7 billion pounds in television revenue, and that is a significant amount. So does it affect? Is it enough to affect the competition? No. And here we are. There is no deal. And we've now got, as Jonathan alluded to, the independent regulator for English football coming in. This is a government-appointed person who is now going to have to decide what happens next. And is that I'm not sure. Again, we're getting into weeds, and I know people might be yawning when we talk about regulators and parachutes and things like this sometimes, but it kind of is important. Do we want this person now to be the arbiter of this, or should football find a way, Jonathan?
Well, in an ideal world, the FA would do this, and the FA used to do this. But the problem is, and we've seen this with UEFA, we've seen this with FIFA, we've talked about this. As soon as the governing body, the body that should do what's right for the game, should uphold the laws and the customs and the traditions and the spirit of the game, as soon as it is trying to make money by organising competitions, it's massively compromised. So the FA, it's the FA Premier League. The FA runs the Premier League. And so how can it regulate anything? Of course it's going to be biased towards the Premier League. It'd be absurd if it weren't. It should be, because that's its competition. And so you can't then have the FA saying, well, Premier League, this is the correct amount that you should give in solidarity payments to the league to try and resolve some of these issues, because the FA, even if it somehow can generate a position of objectivity, the Football League will never believe that. So it's as soon as it got in bed with the Premier League, it lost that right, and therefore football in this country did not have the regulator. So I understand the appeal of a regulator. I understand the need for a regulator. I think it's very sad that has to fall without football. And I'm also, look, I broadly think it's better to have one than not to have one, because at least it is something. Having seen how regulators operate in other spheres, I'm deeply sceptical about how effective it'll be. Look at Ofwat, which has been a complete joke in terms of regulating the water industry, the privatised water industry, which continues to be an absolute disgrace that nobody seems able to get a hold of. And that's something as basic and fundamental and necessary to life as water. Like, the idea that we'd hold football to a higher standard than water is ludicrous. And that's just sort of an example of the absolute failure of privatisation in certain spheres, and the danger of private equity and investment running something that should just be sort of a basic right, should be an absolute fundamental of life. You see in banking that the banking regulator, from what I understand, I wouldn't claim to be an expert in this, but our banking regulator in the UK, I think, is pretty well respected on a global scale. It's massively underfunded, because who's going to fund it as well as the banks can fund their lawyers? So everything's going to be this sort of very gentle negotiation. It can't sort of start slapping down swinging fines, because the banks can overpower them financially in the same way the Saudi PIF or the state of Abu Dhabi or massive private equity companies can overwhelm the FA, the Football League, and the government-appointed football regulator.
Yeah, like Manchester United, the water companies were debt-free before privatisation. Neat segue there, and and they raised all of those debts to pay huge dividends to themselves, effectively under the watch of this regulator. So, as you've said, we can't guarantee a regulator will do a great job there. But in terms of how the rules are governed as well, part of the problem, at least as far as I see it, is like the Premier League teams dictate the rules of the game. So 14 votes of the Premier League will decide what the Premier League does. So a huge amount of self-interest. And we've talked about the type of owners, whether they're private equity companies or billionaires who live off in tax havens, etc. They're not naturally aligned with, spreading the wealth. So it's hard to see that they're going to do it themselves unless somebody forces them to do it. And the data, just looking at a bit of the data that report that the EFL produced, the average revenues of clubs without a parachute, as Jack said, is 20 million pounds. The parachute in the 2021 season, which was what the data's from, was 33 million. So you're getting, without even playing a season, you're getting handed more than a team will earn in an entire season. And the points gap was 16 points in 2021 with the parachute. The average points gap over 5 seasons for teams with parachute payments 8.6. So something definitely needs to be done from a competitive side. And I was thinking, trying to wrap my brains, what would I do? One idea, and we've talked about how wages, as Miguel always has said, as using the data there, it's one of Miguel's favorites, I think. It's the amount of wages that clubs spend dictate the performance, not necessarily the transfer fees. So I thought, well, what if we have a rule that all teams, so not if you're Manchester City or Luton in the Premier League, every team would have to have a relegation clause built into every single contract by fiat. That is what happens in English football. So the cliff edge is there. Now you could say, why would a player sign for this team? And then we can try and get into that. But if you can't play funny games here and say, like, everyone has to have the relegation clause, and that is a specific percentage of whatever is decided by the powers that be. Do we trust them? I don't know, having listened to this conversation. But yeah. And then you then reduce the cliff edge potentially by saying, well, look, if you stay in the Premier League, you maintain that payroll. And if you don't, and the club has its hands up as well for the players, everything is very clear. Do you think that could make a difference, maybe?
Yeah, I do think that mandatory. Yeah, so this is something that Neville actually mentioned to Daniel Levy, is the idea of mandatory relegation clauses for players. I think would smooth that to an extent. But I was just thinking in the context of, I mean, if you're pessimistic that anything much will change and that the distorting parachute payment system will continue, it does make me think, no wonder teams have a documentary. Like no one, no one. If you're competing in a league, and whether it's Wrexham or Birmingham, or frankly any of those championship teams who are not in receipt of that money or have not had access to that money, whether it's Derby County, Coventry City, who obviously come close to promotion but haven't been able to do it. Even smaller teams in the Championship who are trying to fight their way back up. If you're competing with teams whose revenue is at least double yours because of their gift, which is what it is really, a gift for the Premier League, why wouldn't you try and sell yourself is the wrong way of putting it, but why wouldn't you do this cool commercial thing which will bring in, or could hopefully bring in, lots of extra money?
Yeah, and it makes sense in that if you're trying to equalise financial disparity, there's two ways of doing it. You either give money to one party or you take money off the other. So if you're generating money, that is a more positive way of doing it than some levy or tax on the bigger, richer teams. And the problem with doing that, you might say, I mean, I don't know how it would work in terms of company law and things. There may be reasons why you couldn't do that anyway. But say you could, I don't know, put a levy on all transfers, or even say, I don't know, 5% of all wages goes into a pot that's divided equally among everybody to try and equalise this. The problem is that the Premier League clubs aren't really competing with the Championship clubs. They're competing with European clubs. And if you're suddenly handing an advantage to Spanish clubs, French clubs, German clubs, Italian clubs, well, nobody wants that either. And I think this is a conversation we never have. And maybe it's a podcast we should do. In an ideal world, if you were FIFA and you were designing what the globe should look like from a football point of view, what would it look like? Because you certainly would have clubs from more than 4 plus PSG able to win the Champions League. You certainly wouldn't have an obvious top 2 in Spain, top, 2 or 3 in Italy, top 1 in Germany. We're fortunate in the Premier League. We've got, I suspect the top 4 this season, but Villa and Newcastle won't be too far off. The top 4 to 6 in this country, maybe even 7 if you include Tottenham, maybe 8 if you include Manchester United, who I know is the 5th favourites to win the league this season, which seems absurd to me, but I guess that's just as lots of United fans. At least we here, I think probably by dint of being at the top of the global pyramid, have that competitiveness at the top. But what are we aiming at? What should the relation between the top clubs in Europe and the top clubs in the Premier League be? What should relations between the top clubs in the Premier League and the bottom clubs in the Premier League be? What should relations between the Premiership clubs, Premier League clubs, and the Championship clubs be? What should the relationship between the Championship clubs and League One clubs, and so on down in every country? If you don't have that conversation, how can you possibly take the steps to get to where you want to be? And because I think we've never had that conversation, people look at one part of the puzzle, they don't look at the whole. You end up with parachute payments which do solve one problem, but just create another problem somewhere else. And I think it's that discussion that English football, European football, global football never has and has never had and will never have under current governance. That's the problem.
Maybe that's a conversation we should have at Libero. What should football look like? Because we and maybe that's the best place for us to end this podcast on a less negative note than we normally.
I feel pretty negative.
Yeah, but we're at least creating we're setting up the possibility for optimism and utopianism on Libero instead of just complaining, which is a change of tone at least. Well, thank you very much to Jonathan. Thank you, Tariq. Thank you, producer Tom. Thank you to everyone who listens and emails in with your questions and comments. We're very grateful. And we will be back again at the start of next week to continue our look forward to the 2025-26 season.